West Australian MP Andrew Hastie is campaigning for a no vote. He's been talking to National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
I'll be voting no because I think marriage, as it's currently defined, is both a public and societal good. It's a special union between a man and a woman. It's a meeting of body and mind. It begins with consent and is sealed by sexual intercourse. And because the sexual union is at the heart of marriage, there's also procreative potential. And because of that fact, it's inherently ordered towards family life. Now, the reason why the state has an interest in marriage is because of the welfare of children. And so I think it would be good to leave marriage as it is currently defined for that reason.
Right, so do you see it primarily as a religious institution or, in fact, a civil one under law?
Well, throughout history there's been cultural and religious preferences for marriage, but ultimately when you survey all of history, marriage has always been known as a man and a woman. We're talking about the Civil Act, the Federal Act, and so I only make arguments from the position of reason. I use reason to advance my case. So yes, there is a religious component, but certainly people of faith and no faith can hold to the traditional definition of marriage.
How, in your view, would the institution of marriage be in some way downgraded or detrimentally affected in any way if same-sex marriage did become the law of the land?
Well, the Yes case argues that we'd be broadening it, but in fact we'd be redefining it and we'd be removing gender from marriage. As I said, the objective structure of marriage has always included a man and a woman who have procreative potential and therefore the capacity to start a family. So there's a whole range of consequences. I think if we obscure the purpose and meaning of marriage, people will be less likely to practice it. There's also implications for freedom of thought, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. And there have been people in the media over the last week or so who are saying there are no consequences, particularly as it pertains to religious freedom. And I strongly disagree. It just ain't true. If you look at the Senate Select Committee report into the draft amendment bill, the Attorney General's Department gave evidence that there would be up to 60 consequential amendments across 25 federal acts if we redefine marriage. And that's before we even start talking about how the federal law intersects with state law such as anti-discrimination, charity, inheritance law. So there are consequences, and if you survey Western jurisdictions over the last 10 years or so where they have legalised same-sex marriage, there are countless or plenty of examples where people have been coerced by the state, they've been coerced by the judiciary, there's been cyber lynchings, there's a whole range of examples that I could tell you about.
Just on that argument that you've raised there about states who control anti-discrimination laws, you appear to have John Howard on your side in that respect, although he seems to be making these arguments, at least contemplating the possibility that same-sex marriage will prevail in this survey process. Do you go that far? Do you actually think this is something that needs to be embedded in law just in case that that side of the argument prevails?
Absolutely. Freedom of thought, conscience and religion must be protected in any amended bill. That's my view. Because as we've seen in Tasmania, the anti-discrimination laws down there, we've had Archbishop Porteous, we've had Campbell Markham, we've had David Gee taken to court for expressing a view that actually accords with the Marriage Act as it presently stands. So I think if people say there are no consequences, they're being either naive, intellectually lazy or dishonest.
All right. Well, you're arguing some fairly core principles around the institution of marriage today, and yet there are others in the No campaign who are talking about gender fluidity, the Safe Schools campaign, or program, I suppose you would call it, curriculum. Do you think they're wandering off track? Would you prefer that the No campaign targeted the sort of things that you're highlighting here today?
Well, look, I've tried to paint a positive vision of marriage, and I think ultimately this debate is about the question, what is a marriage? And so we have to talk about consequences if we're going to redefine it. And I think they're perfectly within their right to look at Canada, to look at the United Kingdom, to look at Australia, where we saw the Safe Schools Coalition brought into our schools without consent of a lot of parents. In fact, the Safe Schools Coalition program sought to cleave the child-parent relationship. And so I think it's perfectly okay to make that case. And Bill Shorten can get on his high horse and have a go at those mums. I'll tell you what, I'll back those mums over Bill Shorten every day of the week. They shouldn't be attacked for caring for the well-being of their children.
All right, just finally, Andrew Hastie, interpreting the result of the postal survey in the electorate of Canning, how are you going to go about that when the result comes back?
Sure, I've always said I will respect the will of the Australian people, and, you know, that's why I've advocated for a plebiscite, because everyone should have their say. So I don't think anyone on the No campaign will frustrate the will of the Australian people if the yes vote indeed prevails with the postal survey.
But that doesn't mean you'd actually vote for the bill in the Parliament.
That's right. I would likely abstain on the substantive bill, but I would fight very, very hard to make sure that the right protections are in place to protect individuals and form bodies along the lines of freedom of thought, conscience and religion.
All right, well, I'm sure we'll hear from you again through the course of this campaign. Andrew Hastie, thank you.